When Issei Sagawa murdered, dismembered, and devoured Renee Hartevelt in 1981, he was fulfilling a dream 32 years in the making. Sagawa, who was born in Kobe, Japan, was studying comparative literature in Paris at the time of his crime. He was almost immediately arrested and sentenced to a psychiatric hospital. But after his extradition to Japan, he was able to check himself out of a different psychiatric hospital due to a legal loophole and remains free to this day. In the years since, he has effectively made a living off his crime, and he's even become something of a minor celebrity in Japan. He has appeared on numerous talk shows and written manga novels that graphically depict killing and eating Hartevelt. He has even starred in soft-core porn reenactments where he bites actors. And throughout his life, he has been chillingly unrepentant. When he discusses his crime, it's as if he believes it's the most natural thing in the world, and he plans to do it again. Issei Sagawa was born on April 26, 1949, and for as long as he can remember, he possessed cannibalistic urges and a fascination with eating human flesh. He remembered with fondness his uncle dressing up as a monster and lowering him and his brother into a stew pot for eating. He sought out fairy tales that involved humans being eaten, and his favorite was Hansel and Gretel. He even recalls noticing classmates' thighs in the first grade and thinking, "Yum, that looks delicious." He blames the media's representation of Western women, like Grace Kelly, for sparking his cannibalistic fantasies, equating it with what most people would call sexual desire. Where other people dreamed of bedding these beautiful women, Sagawa dreamed of eating them. Issei Sagawa says, the reasons behind his cannibalistic tendencies can't be explained to or conceptualized by anyone who doesn't share his exact urges. It's simply a fetish, he said. For example, if a normal man fancied a girl, he'd naturally feel a desire to see her as often as possible, to be close to her, to smell her and kiss her, right? To me, eating is just an extension of that. Frankly, I can't fathom why everyone doesn't feel this urge to eat, to consume other people. He maintains, however, that he never thought of killing them, only gnawing on their flesh. He was always short and skinny, with legs that looked like pencils, he wrote in his best-selling book In the Fog. And he believed that at just under 5 feet tall, he was too repulsive to attract the kind of physical intimacy that would have tempered his desires. Although Sagawa did once attempt to see a psychiatrist for his urges at age 15, he found it unhelpful and retreated further into his isolated psyche. Then, in 1981, after repressing his desires for 32 years, he finally acted on them. Issei Sagawa had moved to Paris to study literature at the Sorbonne, a public research university. Once there, he said, his cannibalistic urges took over. Almost every night I would bring a prostitute home and then try to shoot them from behind, he wrote in the Fog. It became less about wanting to eat them, but more an obsession with the idea that I simply had to carry out this ritual of killing a girl no matter what. Eventually, he found the perfect victim. Renee Hartevelt was a Dutch student studying with Sagawa at the Sorbonne. Over time, Sagawa struck up a friendship with her, occasionally inviting her to his home for dinner. At some point, he gained her trust. He attempted to kill her once, unsuccessfully, before actually murdering her. The first time, the gun misfired when her back was turned. Though most would take this as a sign to give up, it only pushed Sagawa further down his rabbit hole. It made me even more hysterical, and I knew that I simply had to kill her, he said. The very next night, he did. This time, the gun fired and Hartevelt was killed instantly. Sagawa only felt a moment of remorse before he became elated. I thought about calling an ambulance, he recalled. But then I thought, hang on, don't be stupid. You've been dreaming about this for 32 years, and now it's actually happening. Immediately after killing her, he raped her corpse and began cutting her open. The first thing I did was cut into her buttock. No matter how deep I cut, all I saw was the fat beneath the skin. It looked like corn, and it took a while to actually reach the red meat, Sagawa recalled. The moment I saw the meat, I tore a chunk off with my fingers and threw it into my mouth. It was truly a historical moment for me. Ultimately, he said his only regret was that he hadn't eaten her while she was alive. What I truly wished was to eat her living flesh, he said. Nobody believes me, but my ultimate intention was to eat her. Not necessarily to kill her. 2 days after killing Hartevelt, Sagawa disposed of what remained of her body. He had eaten or frozen most of her pelvic region, so he put her legs, torso, and head into 2 suitcases and hailed a cab. The taxi dropped him off at the Bois de Boulogne Park, which had a secluded lake inside it. He had planned to drop the suitcases in it, but several people noticed the suitcases dripping blood and notified the French police. When police found Sagawa and questioned him, his response was a simple admission. "I killed her to eat her flesh," he said. Issei Sagawa awaited his trial for 2 years in a French prison. When it was finally time for him to be tried, French judge Jean-Louis Bruguière declared him legally insane and unfit to stand trial, dropping the charges and ordering him to be held indefinitely in a mental institution. They then deported him back to Japan, where he was supposed to spend the rest of his days in a Japanese mental hospital. But he didn't. Because the charges in France had been dropped, the court documents were sealed and couldn't be released to Japanese authorities. Therefore, the Japanese had no case against Issei Sagawa and no choice but to let him walk free. And on August 12, 1986, Issei Sagawa checked himself out of the Matsuzawa Psychiatric Hospital in Tokyo. He has been free ever since. Today, Issei Sagawa walks the streets of Tokyo where he lives, free to do as he pleases. A terrifying thought when one hears that the threat of life in prison hasn't done much to quell his urges. The desire to eat people becomes so intense around June, when women start wearing less and showing more skin, he said. Just today, I saw a girl with a really nice derriere on my way to the train station. When I see things like that, I think about wanting to eat someone again before I die. What I'm saying is, I can't bear the thought of leaving this life without ever tasting that derriere that I saw this morning, or her thighs. He continued, I want to eat them again while I'm alive, so that I can at least be satisfied when I die. He's even planned out how he will do it. I think either sukiyaki or shabu-shabu, lightly boiled thin slices, is the best way to go, in order to really savor the natural flavor of the meat. In the meantime, however, Sagawa has refrained from cannibalism. But that hasn't stopped him from capitalizing on his crime. He wrote restaurant reviews for the Japanese magazine Spa and enjoyed success on a lecture circuit, talking about his urges and crime. And to date, he has published 20 books. His most recent book is called Extremely Intimate Fantasies of Beautiful Girls, and it is filled with pictures drawn by himself as well as by famous artists. I hope that people who read it will at least stop thinking of me as a monster, he said. Sagawa allegedly suffers from diabetes and suffered 2 heart attacks in 2015. He is now 72, lives with his brother in Tokyo, and continues to garner media attention. And in 2018, French filmmakers recorded the two talking. Sagawa's brother asks him, "As your brother, would you eat me?" The only response Sagawa gives is an empty stare and silence. Karla Homolka met Paul Bernardo at a hotel restaurant in 1987. She was 17 years old at the time and working as a volunteer at an animal hospital. Bernardo was 23. By 1989, the couple were engaged. They got married in 1991, but not before they raped several women and caused the death of 15-year-old Tammy Homolka and 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey. In December of 1990, Veterinary technician Karla Homolka stole a vial of sedatives from the office where she worked. One night, as her family hosted a dinner party, she drugged her 15-year-old sister, carried her to the basement, and presented her to her boyfriend Paul Bernardo as a virgin sacrifice. From there, the sadistic acts between Karla Homolka and Paul Bernardo only escalated. They began a torture spree that lasted years and resulted in the deaths of several teen girls in and around Toronto, including Homolka's sister, before they were finally caught in 1992. Together, they were known as the Ken and Barbie Killers. When their crimes were discovered, Karla Homolka made a controversial deal with prosecutors and served 12 years in prison for manslaughter, while Paul Bernardo is still behind bars to this day. Homolka, however, got out on July 4, 2005, and has lived her life out of the spotlight ever since. But 30 years on, following the sensationalized trial and controversial plea deal, Karla Homolka today lives a completely different life. She settled comfortably in Quebec, where she is a part of a quiet community and volunteers at a local elementary school. It seems that Karla Homolka come a long way from her days as one half of the Ken and Barbie Killers. Many experts believe that Karla Homolka always had sociopathic tendencies. Those experts assert that it wasn't until her late teens that Homolka's dangerous tendencies revealed themselves. In her early life, Homolka was, for all intents and purposes, a normal kid. Born May 4, 1970, she grew up in Ontario, Canada, in a well-adjusted family of 5 as the oldest of the 3 daughters. Her friends from school remember her as smart, attractive, popular, and an animal lover. Indeed, following her high school graduation, she began working at a local veterinary clinic. But then, on a fateful midsummer trip for work to a veterinary convention in Toronto in 1987, 17-year-old Homolka met 23-year-old Paul Bernardo. The two connected instantly and became inseparable. Karla Homolka and Paul Bernardo also developed a shared taste for sadomasochism, with Bernardo as the master and Homolka as the slave. Some believed that Homolka had been coerced by Bernardo to commit the heinous crimes that later landed her in prison. It has been asserted that Homolka was merely yet another one of Bernardo's victims. But still others believe that Karla Homolka entered into the relationship willingly and was every bit a sadistic criminal mastermind as he was. What can't be denied is that Karla Homolka willingly offered up her own sister to Bernardo. Bernardo had apparently been upset by the fact that Homolka had not been a virgin when they met. In order to make up for this, he allegedly ordered that Homolka bring him a girl who was a virgin, and Homolka decided upon her own sister, Tammy. On December 23, 1990, Karla Homolka's family hosted a holiday party. Earlier that morning, Homolka had stolen vials of sedatives from the veterinary office where she worked. That night, she spiked her sister's eggnog with halcyon and brought her downstairs to the bedroom, where Bernardo was waiting. However, this wasn't the first time that Homolka had brought her sister to Bernardo. In July, she and Bernardo spiked the teenager's spaghetti dinner with Valium, but Bernardo had raped the younger sister for only a minute before she began to wake up. The Ken and Barbie Killers were thus more careful this second time around, and Bernardo held a rag coated in halothane up to Tammy's face when she was brought into the bedroom that holiday night, and raped her while she was unconscious. Likely due to the drugs, Tammy vomited whilst unconscious and then choked to death. In a panic, Bernardo and Homolka cleaned and clothed her body, laid her on the bed, and claimed that she had vomited in her sleep. Her death was consequently ruled an accident. Despite her family tragedy, Homolka and Bernardo were wed 6 months later in a lavish ceremony near Niagara Falls. Bernardo allegedly insisted that Homolka vow to love, honor, and obey him. Karla Homolka also agreed to provide Bernardo with young victims. Homolka gifted her husband with another 15-year-old girl, a pet shop worker whom Homolka had met through her veterinary work. On June 7, 1991, shortly after their wedding, Homolka invited the girl, known only as Jane Doe, to a girls' night out. As the couple had done with Tammy, Homolka spiked the young girl's drink and delivered her to Bernardo at the couple's new home. This time, however, Homolka raped the girl herself before Bernardo. Fortunately, the young woman survived the ordeal, though due to the drugs she didn't know what had happened to her until later. A week after the rape of Jane Doe, Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka found their penultimate victim, a 14-year-old girl named Leslie Mahaffey. Mahaffey had been walking home after dark one night when Bernardo noticed her from his car and pulled over. When Mahaffey stopped him to ask for a cigarette, he dragged her into his car and drove the couple's house. There, he and Homolka proceeded to repeatedly rape and torture Mahaffey while videotaping the entire ordeal. Bob Marley and David Bowie played in the background. The videotape was deemed too graphic and disturbing to show at the eventual trial, but the audio was allowed. On it, Bernardo can be heard instructing Mahaffey to submit to him while she cried out in pain. At one point, Mahaffey can be heard commenting that the blindfold Homolka had placed over her eyes was slipping, and that she might be able to see them and later identify them. Unwilling to let that happen, Bernardo and Homolka committed their first intentional murder. Homolka drugged the girl as she had done in the past, but this time administered a lethal dose. Bernardo went to the local hardware store and purchased several bags of cement, which the couple used to encase the dismembered parts of Leslie Mahaffey's body. Then, they dumped the body-filled blocks into a local lake. Later, one of these blocks would wash up on the lakeshore and reveal an orthodontic implant, which would identify Mahaffey as the couple's third murder victim. However, before that could happen, one more teenaged girl would fall victim to the murderous duo in 1992, a 15-year-old named Kristen French. As they had done with Leslie Mahaffey, the couple filmed themselves raping and torturing her, and forced her to consume alcohol, and submit not only to Bernardo's sexual deviances, but to Homolka's as well. This time, however, it appeared that the couple intended to murder their victim from the get-go, as French was never blindfolded. Kristen French's body was found in April of 1992. She was naked with her hair cut in a roadside ditch. Homolka later admitted that the hair had not been cut as a trophy, but in the hopes that it would make it harder for the police to identify her. Despite her hand in the rape and torture of 4 young girls and the murder of 3, Karla Homolka was never actually arrested for her crimes. Instead, she turned herself in. In December of 1992, Paul Bernardo beat Homolka with a metal flashlight, severely bruising and landing her in the hospital. She was released after insisting that she had been in an automobile accident, but suspicious friends of hers alerted her aunt and uncle that foul play may have been involved. Meanwhile, Canadian authorities were in search of the so-called Scarborough rapist and felt confident they had found their criminal in Paul Bernardo. He was subsequently swabbed for DNA and fingerprinted, as was Homolka. During that period of questioning, Homolka learned that Bernardo had been identified as the rapist, and to protect herself, Homolka admitted to her uncle that Bernardo had abused her, that he was the Scarborough rapist, and that she had been involved in several of his crimes. Horrified, Homolka's family insisted she go to the police, which she ultimately did. Immediately, Homolka began filling the police in on Bernardo's crimes, including ones he had committed before they met that he had boasted about to her. While their house was being searched, Bernardo's lawyer wandered in and retrieved some 100 audio tapes from behind a light fixture on which the couple had recorded their heinous crimes. The lawyer kept those tapes hidden. In court, Homolka painted herself as an unwilling and abused pawn in Bernardo's horrific schemes. Homolka divorced Bernardo during this time, and many jurors were inclined to believe that Homolka was indeed nothing more than a victim. She reached a plea bargain in 1993 and was sentenced to 12 years in prison with eligibility for parole after 3 years of good behavior. Canadian press deemed this choice on behalf of the court a deal with the devil. Karla Homolka now continues to receive backlash for what many have dubbed the worst plea deal in Canadian history. Bernardo was convicted on almost 30 counts of rape and murder, and received a life sentence on September 1st, 1995. In February 2018, he was denied parole. Homolka was released in 2005 to outrage from the public, much of which had been ongoing since her short sentence was announced. After her release, she remarried and settled into a small community in Quebec. Karla Homolka now has come under the scrutiny of this community. Neighbors began a Facebook page titled "Watching Karla Homolka" in an effort to track her whereabouts out of fear and anger about her freedom. She has since changed her name to Leanne TL. She spent some time in Antilles and Guadeloupe under the name Leanne Bordelais with her new husband. But as of 2014, had returned to the Canadian province where she spends time evading the press, spending time with her family of 3 children, and volunteering on her children's field trips. Karla Homolka now seems far removed from those disturbing days of the Ken and Barbie killers. What started out as a college romance ended in murder and mystery. Scott Peterson and Lassie Rocha met in 1994 while both were attending college at California Polytechnic State University. They married 2 years later. In 2002, Lassie became pregnant. The two lived in Modesto, California, and planned to raise their unborn son Connor there. Scott Peterson says that on Christmas Eve morning, he left his pregnant wife alone to go fishing about 90 miles away at the Berkeley Marina. He says that Lassie planned to walk the couple's dog, Mackenzie, and mop the kitchen floor. When Scott returned home hours later, he says he found Mackenzie there alone, still wearing a leash, but no sign of Lassie. That evening, Lassie's stepfather called the police to report her missing. Family, friends, and volunteers launched a huge search for Lassie Peterson. Scott Peterson was interviewed by police in the early hours of Christmas Day. Now retired Modesto police detective John Boeller says, "Scott didn't seem as interested as one would expect. Oftentimes, a victim who's left behind is firing tons of questions at us, and we didn't get any of that from him." Less than a week after Lassie Peterson went missing, Modesto detectives raced over to investigate an intriguing lead. A Fresno massage therapist named Amber Frey revealed that she had been dating Scott Peterson for over a month. She told police that Peterson had lied to her and said he was single. Former Detective Boiler notes, "Her recall was fantastic. It was almost like it was a script from a Hallmark TV show or something." Amber Frey recalled every detail of their romantic dates, down to what they were wearing, hoping for clues that might lead them to the missing woman. Detectives ask Frey to record phone calls between her and Scott Peterson, and she agrees. In an explosive press conference 1 month after Lassie Peterson goes missing, Amber Frey publicly reveals her affair with Scott Peterson. "I am very sorry for Lassie's family and the pain that this has caused them," she said. "And I pray for her safe return as well." Prior to Frey going public, Peterson had told her in a recorded call that he was in Paris when he was really in Modesto, while the search for Lassie was still on. Eventually, Scott admitted to her, "I've lied to you that I've been traveling." Those recorded calls would later become part of a damning case against Peterson. On April 13th and 14th, 2003, 2 bodies are found on the shores of the San Francisco Bay. They are later identified as Lassie Peterson and her unborn child. The 2 bodies were found about a mile apart. Authorities caught up with Scott Peterson on April 18th at a golf course in San Diego and arrested him. Authorities found a wad of cash, his brother's ID card, and multiple cell phones inside the vehicle. Days later, Peterson pleaded not guilty to 2 counts of capital murder. Scott Peterson's trial begins in San Mateo County, California, in June 2004. Because of massive publicity, the trial was moved from Modesto to Redwood City, in San Mateo County. The decision was made because the judge decided it would be difficult for Peterson to get a fair trial too close to home, where emotions were running high. In what many consider a major turning point of the trial, Amber Frey took the stand for the first time to tell the jury about her relationship with Scott Peterson, a secretly married man, and about all the lies he told her. Frey painted a picture of a dishonest man who could tell falsehoods with ease, hurting his credibility. Jurors heard the lies for themselves in those recorded phone calls Frey made. Scott Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder for the death of his wife Lassie and second-degree murder for the death of his unborn son Connor. Crowds outside cheer. In March 2005, 4 months after his conviction, Scott Peterson is sentenced to death. At a press conference, juror number 7, Rochelle Nice, called Peterson a jerk and commented San Quentin is your new home, referring to the prison where he would serve his sentence. Nice was nicknamed Strawberry Shortcake during the trial because of her hair color. In August 2020, after 2 appeals, Scott Peterson's death sentence was overturned by the California Supreme Court after deciding that the original trial judge made a mistake when jurors were being picked for trial. The result of that mistake, Peterson's supporters say, was that the jury was stacked with pro-death penalty jurors. Peterson, shown here in 2018, will now receive a new trial for only the sentence phase. The court upheld his murder convictions. The California Supreme Court orders a lower court to re-examine Peterson's murder convictions and decide if he should get an entire new trial. Scott Peterson's supporters say it all comes down to the actions of that juror once nicknamed Strawberry Shortcake, Rochelle Nice, pictured here in 2005. During jury selection, prospective jurors filled out a questionnaire asking if they had in the past been in a lawsuit and if they had been crime victims. Nice checked no. It's pretty clear that she lied to us straight to our face about her own situation, Peterson's current attorney, Pat Harris, stated. In fact, Nice was involved in 2 domestic disputes in the past. But prosecutors say when Nice filled out that questionnaire, she didn't lie. She just didn't think her past experiences were relevant to the questions and didn't see herself as a victim. Now a lower court will consider if Peterson will get a complete retrial. In March 2021, CBS News' Jonathan Vigliotti interviewed Scott Peterson's sister-in-law, Janie Peterson, in her war room of evidence. She claims proves his innocence. She claims witnesses saw Lassie walking in the neighborhood near the Peterson home after the time Scott said he left for the fishing trip. If that's true, Scott couldn't have killed Lassie. Scott Peterson's attorney explains, "There's been a lot of criticism because we didn't call some witnesses who saw Lassie that day, and that the thought process at the time was that a number of the witnesses who saw her didn't have great memories or were contradicting each other." Retired Detective John Boiler says there are no witnesses who saw Lassie alive that morning. He says there were other young women in the neighborhood who were pregnant and looked similar to Lassie, and that it would be real easy for somebody to mistakenly see one of those 3 girls as being Lassie. Still, Janie Peterson insists that Scott is innocent. Perhaps more important to a new defense case is what Janie Peterson believes actually happened to Lassie. She points to a burglary she believes happened on the same day Lassie disappeared, right across the street from the Peterson home. Scott Peterson's supporters theorize that Lassie confronted the burglars, and that ended badly. But police quickly arrested the burglars, Stephen Todd and Donald Pierce, pictured here in a 2003 Modesto Police Department press release. Scott Peterson appeared in court remotely for a status hearing on a new death penalty trial. In December 2021, Scott Peterson is sentenced to life in prison without parole. Peterson and his supporters maintain the wrong man is in prison for Lassie and Connor's deaths. According to Detective Boiler, well, I guess it's possible. But there's still people that believe the earth is flat too. Shanann Watts was facing health problems in 2010 when she met Chris. I was in a really, really, really bad place. And I got a friend request from Chris on Facebook. She said in an online video about 4 months before her death. I was like, oh, what the heck? I'm never going to meet him. Well, one thing led to another, and 8 years later, we have 2 kids. We live in Colorado, and he's the best thing that has ever happened to me. After the couple moved to Colorado, they started a family. Bella was born in December 2013. Shanann was so excited to have her first baby girl, her family wrote in her obituary, how she loved and cherished her. Less than 2 years later, in July 2015, Celeste was born. Oh, how Shanann was so excited to be able to have another child because of her battle with lupus, her family wrote. Every moment with her was a blessing. In 2018, Shanann became pregnant again with a baby boy she planned to name Nico. By all outward appearances, the couple's marriage was strong. However, in the summer of 2018, Shanann noticed that things had changed. He has changed. I don't know who he is. She texted a friend on August 7th. He hasn't touched me all week. Kissed me, talked to me except for when I'm trying to figure out what is wrong. We've never had a problem in our relationship like this. I just want to cry. Shanann and the girls were last seen on Monday, August 13th, 2018. Chris Watts gave a series of stilted television interviews after their disappearance, pleading for their safe return. We had an emotional conversation, he told Denver 7, a day after his family was reported missing. She wasn't here. The kids weren't here. Nobody was here. On August 16th, Shanann's body was found on the property of Anadarko Petroleum Corporation, an oil and gas company where Chris had worked. Daughters Bella and Celeste were located later that day in oil tanks near Shanann's body. Shanann had been strangled, while the girls had been smothered, all with Chris' bare hands. Chris was arrested on 3 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of tampering with a body. While in police custody, Chris claimed that he told Shanann that he wanted to separate. He alleged that he went downstairs and noticed Shanann strangling Celeste, and that Bella's lifeless body was nearby. He ran upstairs in a rage, he claimed, and strangled Shanann. Cops didn't believe his story. His story didn't match the evidence that we had, police stated at the time. We believe that Chris killed them all. Authorities soon learned that Chris was having an affair with Nicole Kessinger, who worked at his company. After she learned about the murders, Kessinger cooperated with the police. Before coming forward, Kessinger appeared to worry about the public shaming that she might face. Did people hate Amber Frey? She typed into an internet search, invoking the name of the woman who was having an affair with infamous killer Scott Peterson, who murdered his wife, Lassie, and their unborn child in 2002. Kessinger told authorities that she believed that Watts was going through an amicable divorce. Hundreds of mourners assembled at Sacred Heart Catholic Church in Pinehurst, North Carolina, to pay their final respects to Shanann, her daughters, and her unborn son, Nico. I always worried about her and the girls being so far because I couldn't protect them. Shannon's brother, Frankie R. Zukek, wrote in her eulogy. Zuzek didn't mention Chris Watts in his eulogy, but had previously lashed out at him, calling him a heartless psychopath and saying he stole my whole world. In a bombshell turn of events, on November 6, 2018, Watts pleaded guilty to the slayings of his pregnant wife and their young children in exchange for being spared a possible death sentence. The evidence against him was overwhelming. He had no choice, considering the evidence. It took time for him to come around, but he did. But not everyone was happy with the plea agreement. Watts' mother, Cindy, said in several interviews that she thought the confession and the plea were coerced. On November 19, 2018, Watts was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The defendant coldly and deliberately ended 4 lives, prosecutors said of Shanann, her girls, and her unborn child. During the victim impact statements, Shannon's father, Frank Erzukek, repeatedly referred to Watts as a monster and an evil person. "I have no idea who gave you the right to take their lives," Shannon's mother, Sandra Erzukek, said. "But I know God and his mighty angels were there in that moment to bring them home to paradise." On March 7, 2019, a video of Chris Watts' full confession, which he'd provided to investigators in February, was made public. In the video, he told investigators from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation that on the night of the murders, he'd jumped on Shanann in bed. After he'd told her he didn't love her anymore, he claims she threatened to leave him and take the children. Then Watts drove 45 minutes to a remote oil field with Shanann's corpse in the bed of the truck and his still-living girls in the back seat. Before burying Shanann in a shallow grave, Watts said he smothered Celeste in the back seat. After dumping Celeste's body in an old field, he returned to smother Bella, who begged for her life. As he went to kill her, Bella screamed, "Daddy, no!" And it was the last words she spoke. According to sources, Watts' life in jail is anything but stimulating. For an hour a day, he gets out of his cell for showers and exercise. He remains in the evaluation unit of the prison. In his cell, he's allowed to have a Bible, but not much more. With so much free time, Watts has spent a lot of time thinking about his past, says a friend of Watts. He's sad that everyone is hurting. He wishes he could go back in time. He wishes he had handled things differently. In July 2019, Chris Watts claimed in a chilling jailhouse letter to his mother that he was a changed man with a newfound relationship with God. His mother, Cindy Watts, was interviewed in the HLN special, Killer Dad, Chris Watts Speaks. During the show, she read the letter she received from her son. "I'm still a dad. I'm still a son. No matter what," Watts wrote. "Now, I can add servant of God to that mix. He has shown me peace, love, and forgiveness. And that's how I live every day." A 2020 Netflix documentary, titled American Murder: The Family Next Door, revealed the final text messages Shanann sent her husband. Finally on plane and about to take off, she wrote in her last text to Chris, "Thank God. Prayers for a safe flight. Love you." Chris did not respond. Watts had no criminal record or history of domestic violence before the murders, according to FBI agents, who also explained general warning signs to identify domestic violence. "This case shows that domestic violence can happen anywhere," Lee said. "It affects so many families, and sometimes the results can be deadly." Graham Young could have just been a kid who loved science. But his chemistry set would actually prove to be a lethal tool in the arsenal of a depraved serial killer, earning him the nickname Teacup Poisoner, and eventually life in prison. Graham Young was born in North London, England, on September 7, 1947, and didn't have the easiest start in childhood. When he was a baby, Young's mother Bessie died of tuberculosis. Too distraught to care for his son, Young's father, Fred, sent the child to live with his Aunt Winnie. Young grew attached to his aunt over the next 2 years, and when he went to live with his father after he remarried in 1950, Graham suffered severe separation anxiety. He neglected his peers and took up solitary hobbies. These included a particular fascination with chemistry and toxicology. They also included reading about notorious murderers. Not seeing any warning signs, Frank encouraged Graham Young's penchant for science by buying him a chemistry set. He would spend hours with it, and pupils at his school even took to calling him the Mad Professor. Young became so well versed in the ins and outs of toxicology that he was able to acquire large quantities of poisonous chemicals at the age of 13 by convincing professional chemists he was older, and that the use was for study purposes. That's when Graham Young began testing his knowledge of poisons, using real people as his subjects. He would serve tea laced with poisonous concoctions to his family and schoolmates. In 1961, his stepmother Molly started developing bad stomach cramps. Young's father and older sister began to suffer similar pains soon after. Then, a classmate named Christopher Williams developed similar symptoms. But nobody suspected that Graham Young had anything to do with the mysterious illnesses. They assumed it was some kind of contagious stomach bug. Matters took a turn when Graham Young's sister, Winifred, once again became extremely ill while on her way to work. She was taken to the hospital, where doctors discovered belladonna, the ancient extract of deadly nightshade, in her system. Meanwhile, Young's behavior had gotten progressively more bizarre. He idolized Adolf Hitler and started wearing a swastika. One of his science experiments also blew up in the kitchen of the family home. On April 21, 1962, Molly Young was rushed to the hospital in excruciating pain. She died later that night. It was found out later on that Young had slowly been poisoning his stepmother's tea with antimony, to which she developed a tolerance. The night before her death, he switched to thallium in order to quicken the process. However, Molly was cremated. Thus, her remains couldn't be analyzed, and Young remained on his dark path. But Young's aunt, the one he had lived with as a young child, knew about his fascination was poison and became suspicious. She had him sent to a psychiatrist who recommended calling the police. On May 23, 1962, Graham Young was arrested. He confessed to the murder of his stepmom as well as the poisoning of his other family members. But due to the stepmother's cremation, there was no evidence to substantiate Young's confession, and he wasn't charged with the murder. Instead, he was placed in the Broadmoor Maximum Security Hospital. At age 14, Young was Broadmoor's youngest inmate. By June 1970, his doctors at the hospital deemed him cured. Shockingly, Young informed a psychiatric nurse upon his release that he was planning on killing one person for each year he had been in Broadmoor, according to an article in Criminal Behavior and Mental Health. The comment was recorded in his file, but, stunningly, didn't affect the decision to let him free. Once released, what else would Young do but work at a laboratory that manufactured infrared lenses for military equipment made from thallium? He went to work at John Hadlin Laboratories, where his employers were aware of his psychiatric stay, but didn't know the reason behind it or his criminal history, for that matter. As such, when Young offered to make coffee and tea for his coworkers, they merely viewed it as a kind gesture. Soon, sickness swept through the lab. Young's colleagues chalked it up to a bug going around, as without the knowledge of his disturbing history, they had no reason to suspect that their kind coworker, who always offered them beverages, was actually poisoning them. It was only when an employee named Bob Eagle died that suspicion began to arise yet again. Eagle had gotten better when he was home, only to get sick again when he returned to work. He then became completely debilitated before dying on July 7, 1971. A second death, that of 60-year-old Fred Biggs, occurred soon after. By this point, nearly 70 employees had experienced similar symptoms of the two men who died. Suspicions began to arise yet again. Ultimately, it was Graham Young's own zealousness that did him in. Young asked the staff doctor why thallium poisoning wasn't being considered a cause since it was used on site. Surprised and concerned by Young's in-depth knowledge of toxicology, the doctor reported the exchange to the management, who then alerted the police. An investigative team found Young's diary, in which he described with scientific detachment the experiments of how he poisoned his coworkers. They also found thallium in his pockets. Young was sentenced to life in prison in June 1972. In 1990, he was found dead in his cell, with the official cause of death recorded as a heart attack. But speculation remains that, tired of life in prison, he conducted one final scientific experiment on himself. But Jung's story didn't die with him. Instead, his life and deadly work inspired the Blackley comic 1995 film, The Young Poisoner's Handbook, and he even got his own waxwork for a time at Madame Tussauds Chamber of Horrors in London. If you enjoyed the video, please show your support by subscribing and liking the video, and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any future uploads.